Every journey begins with a single step. For our friend, the hydrogen atom, that step is a bold leap from being part of a water molecule to an emissary of energy. In the heart of an electrolysis chamber, powered by renewable energy, water is transformed. Oxygen steps back, releasing the vibrant hydrogen atom. Alone, hydrogen is volatile, but when paired with captured CO₂ and the help of a touch of alchemy, together, they forge a potent synthetic fuel. A new energy carrier, clean, efficient, ready to power our world. Innovative companies are investing in the production of e-fuels, which can then be distributed via the existing infrastructure to industry and consumers, providing them with a climate-friendly alternative to conventional fossil fuels. Aviation, maritime, heavy goods transport, even your car, e-fuels power a wide range of sectors and offer a sustainable solution to our diverse energy and mobility needs. We at the eFuel Alliance embrace the entire value chain and give it a face and a voice. Our goal is political acceptance and regulatory consideration of e-fuels as a significant contribution to sustainable climate protection. In the quest for green energy, e-fuels are an essential piece of the puzzle, linking today's infrastructure to a more sustainable future. The eFuel Alliance is powering this transition, forging a path from hydrogen to hope, because the future of energy is now.
But first of all, I would like to give some background about the study we have commissioned. So today's topic is quite urgent for the hydrogen and e-fuel industry. It's right in time. We just came out of the European Parliament where an energy omnibus is in discussion, and we hope to see something here soon. As eFuel Alliance, we are of course tracking the global projects in our database with a potential production capacity of 20 billion liters in 2030. But not all of this will be realized. Unfortunately, we have a share of final investment decision of around just 6%. This is way too low. And the reasons for that are, next to a low demand in key regulations like the Renewable Energy Directive of just 1% in 2030 for the transport sector, for example, in the ReFuelEU Aviation and in the FuelEU Maritime, an ideological discussion about the exclusion of target markets like road. The most important challenge at the moment, and something we can solve quite quick, are the restrictive production rules for green hydrogen and e-fuels, or how it is called in Brussels, renewable fuels of non-biological origin. Just as a reminder, if you want to produce green hydrogen, you have to make sure that the electricity comes from installations which are not older than 36 months, and they need to guarantee a temporal correlation, a monthly temporal correlation until 2030, and then hourly, and it need to be geographically in the same bidding zone. And all of this, of course, makes e-fuels more expensive. Independent studies are existing showing that alone the temporal correlation is increasing hydrogen costs by up to 35%. And even the Green German and economic minister, Robert Habeck, wrote a letter last year to the Commission and said that the restrictive production rules are increasing the hydrogen cost by 2.4 euro per kilogram. We think we cannot afford this in the beginning of a technology curve. We don't want to lobby against the delegated acts. We need them in a long-term perspective, but right now it's really hampering the market ramp up. Just imagine you have an electric vehicle and you're just allowed to charge it if you have electricity from new installation and a temporal and geographic correlation. I'm pretty sure there won't be any battery electric vehicles out there. And these vehicles are claimed as zero emission vehicles right now. In February this year, we have sent a letter to the Commission together with 17 industry associations for an early assessment of the delegated acts. And we are happy to see that the Commission has included this in the Clean Industrial Deal. Today, we want to focus not on the electricity criteria, but on other criteria, the CO₂ point sources. And these might be even more difficult to achieve. Industrial point sources are limited until 2041, and if you generate electricity only until 2036. This is too short for eFuel projects, which have an amortization period of 15-20 years. And we don't see a differentiation here between unavoidable process-related CO₂ emissions and energy industrial CO₂ emissions. In addition, the CO₂ point sources needs to be in an effective carbon pricing system like the EU ETS, which does not exist outside of Europe, and therefore killing all eFuel projects with industrial CO₂ sources outside of Europe immediately. We have industrial emissions that we cannot avoid. Just think about breaking up a limestone or produce steel chemicals. You will always have process-related CO₂ emissions. If we keep these industries in Europe, their emissions should be allowed for carbon capture and utilization. Of course, it has to be combined with CCS to reach climate goals, but this has to happen anyway. With the study, we want to start a discussion to differentiate between avoidable energy-related and unavoidable process-related industrial emissions. We see currently a huge run on biogenic point sources, mainly in the Scandinavian countries, and we think it would be smarter to expand the scope to unavoidable industrial emissions. These are highly economic and have a high concentration of CO₂ in the flue gas. We are convinced Europe needs a more pragmatic way if we want to scale up the hydrogen economy as fast as possible and reach our climate goals. With that short statement, I'm happy to hand over to Lino from Frontier Economics, and I want to thank Lino for presenting the results, and I'm looking forward to your presentation. Please take over.
Thank you, Tobias. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome from my end. I'm very much looking forward to presenting and then discussing our study results with you, and also then about thinking about future potential implications resulting for policymaking, for example, from this study. We are looking to take a detailed look at CO₂ point sources potential in Europe, and we are doing that together with the eFuel Alliance and the ENG Coalition this afternoon. Just to reiterate, for those who don't know us, Frontier Economics, we are one of the largest economic consultancies in Europe, have a number of offices spread across Central Europe, including Brussels, Berlin, and so far already comprehensive experience in the CO₂ and carbon capture and utilization and storage sphere. We've done a number of previous works here already on different elements, some of them related more to business cases and financial models, others more to funding applications or to risks and cost of capital, for example. And we used that experience also to feed into the study that we will discuss today, and hopefully we can provide another great impulse for the discussion this afternoon, but also beyond that. Why are we here? Why are we discussing this? We expect that carbon capture used for utilization as well as for storage is expected to play an important role in a decarbonized economy. We can see that there are quite a few projects already in the pipeline in Europe. Many of them, or most of them, are at a very early stage and still more in trialing phase and checking feasibility of the actual implementation and the final investment decision. But we see there's a strong interest by various sectors to pursue this strongly and to thus decarbonize their activities. At the same time, looking into the future, We can see here, based on the European Commission's impact assessment for the 2040 climate targets, that they also regard carbon capture as an important element in fulfilling the targets that we have set ourselves. In 2050, shown here, there's still an amount of more than 400 million tons per CO₂ assumed to be captured in different processes. That is in industry, in power generation, and also from biofuels. This captured CO₂ is then used for different purposes. One of them is storing, but one important of them that we will take a detailed look at today also are e-fuels. And we are going to take a more detailed look now even into the bottom side of the chart, into the capturing. Where can we capture? What type of emissions can be captured where? And then according to current legislation, how can it be used in the top part of this chart for example, e-fuel production? Tobias mentioned that an important background to this work and to this discussion that we are having today is the EC framework for the CO₂ eligibility, which restricts it to industrial sources by a time limit in 2035 and 2040, depending on the activity, as well as the production and combustion of bioproducts. These are the two elements that we'll focus on most, which are most relevant for the European perspective. And we are doing so to assess the European potential of CO₂ point sources with a particular view at e-fuel production. And what we want to do is we want to identify core sectors and assess their potential. That is not only for today, but also for 2050 to see where potential CO₂ point sources could be that are eligible according to legislation and could help us to drive forward decarbonization. We will split the CO₂ point sources by geography, and we will split them by type, that is by process-related emissions, energy-related emissions, and differentiate those emissions of biogenic origin. We are also going to have a look at the impact of the regulatory conditions as they are set out by the European Commission at the moment. To do that, I keep that very brief. The methodology to estimate these emissions and analyze these emissions in 2022 and 2050, we are using renowned sources as the main inputs. That's the European Pollutant Register, EPRTR. And one of our main inputs is also the European Commission's impact assessment, their modeling for the 2040 climate target and the results of that modeling. And then we'll draw on a larger number of further sources, in particular data sources, to provide more of the accurate data differentiation that we will see in a second. What we have done is we have started with identifying core sectors that are particularly important when looking at CO₂ point sources today and also in the future. These include a number of sectors from industry, for example, refineries, metals, or the mineral industry. We include power and heat generation, and thereby focus on plants that are either using gas or using biofuels. We're not looking at coal plants, for example. And we're going to look at CO₂ from the production of biofuels, bioliquids, or biomass fuels. The emissions from these core sectors are going to be differentiated into process-related emissions. So those are emissions that result from chemical processes and cannot be avoided if the process is to be implemented still in the future, for example, cement production or other process emissions in the iron and steel industry. We are looking at energy-related emissions. That's mostly combustion-related emissions. And we're looking at emissions of biogenic origin. The sectors that we are capturing have a total historic emissions, we can see it here, of more than 800 million tons in 2022. And to start with, we're going to take a first look at one of the interim outputs, is how does this amount of emissions spread across Europe, and how does it spread across the emission types? We do see that the largest amount, we see it in the map as well as in the chart, still comes from energy-related emissions, that is the combustion of fuels. And then on top of that, we can see in the dark teal bars, we can see process-related emissions, as well as some biogenic emissions, where we only mostly see smaller bars on the map and fairly distributed across Europe here. What we can see, mostly then from process and energy emissions that are highlighted here in the teal and the red, are specific clusters. The most evident is probably the one around the region of Belgium, Netherlands, and Western Germany. But we can see further significant clusters, for example, in northern Italy, some clusters in the Polish-Czech border, or in southern France, for example. Beyond that, we are able to identify a number of more clusters across Europe, although these then vary according to their emission volumes within these clusters and also according to their emission types within these clusters. If we take a look at kind of specifically these volumes that are seen here, but we want to differentiate them by subsector, we learn that while the energy-related emissions dominate, the largest point sources still come from the iron and steel and the refinery and the chemical industries. We can see that these are most evident on the map here, and also in a volumetric illustration here, that industrial activities contribute the largest amount. In particular, we see that some individual industrial sites stick out in the European perspective even. And we see that it's providing some example. A number of these, for example, iron and steel industry, as shown by ArcelorMittal here, for example, in Spain. There's the Tata Steel plant in the Netherlands. There's a chemical plant in Germany. So what we learn is that today, among the largest point source emitters are really the traditional industries that we're thinking of, whereas other sectors here are less prominent in the very detailed point-specific look of the emission map across Europe. What we want to do in a second step is take a look at how is this going to look like in 2050. And what we do to get there is primarily building on the European Commission's 2040 impact assessment modeling and their results, and taking these inputs. What is done is we look at sectoral production growth and shrinkage expectations. So some sectors are expected to have a similar level of output in the long run. Other sectors are expected to have even a higher level of output. And there are sectors where we expect that the emissions, but next to that, we also have technological change or technological switches. For example, in the steel industry, you might see that there is a switch to electric arc furnaces and to gas or hydrogen-based direct reduction. On top of that, where we don't have technological switches, we might still have fuel switches. For example, in gas applications, there could be a switch from fossil gas to biomethane. This is going to feed into the development, and we're going to have a look at the map showing how does it change over time, these emissions. So this is really now the reductions in emissions, so the delta pretty much, between 2022 and 2050. What we see here that, as hopefully expected, we see across many regions in Europe, now shown on a MtCO₂ level, that we have emission reductions. These relate mostly from iron and steel industries, but also from power plants, the pulp and paper industry, and refineries. But in the course of the time, due to, for example, production growth of specific sectors, we also have emission increases in some regions across Europe. So this just shows emission increases, the delta over time. And we see that most prominently in the region around Belgium, the Netherlands, and Western Germany, but also in the region in Scandinavia. Across both areas, it's mostly bioproducts production as well as chemicals, which make up the most of the increase. If we look at the absolute level, kind of the resulting absolute level of emissions in 2050, then the picture looks as follows. We still see very large point source potentials in a number of regions, but prominently again is the area around the Ruhr Valley and Belgium and the Netherlands. But we can also see that there are further new kind of emission intense regions. For example, in Scandinavia, we now see that there are new kind of large sources or large volumes of emissions in a number of regions, mostly here from biogenic sources. Across other regions of Europe, we also see relevant emission volumes or large emission volumes, but with a more diverse spread of emissions across biogenic sources, across energy-related emissions, and across process emissions. If we take a look at this on a sectoral split, we can see that in some sectors, the modeling results from the EC impact assessment still sees that some fossil emissions are going to take place. These obviously will then have to be compensated or captured. In other sectors, there's a strong switch from fossil fuels to energy fuels, and hence we will see to biogenic fuels, and hence we will see biogenic emissions. What also remains are process emissions here in the non-metallic minerals. That's mostly the cement industry, but also in iron and steel and in the chemicals industries. When thinking about the implications for e-fuel production, as Tobias introduced, we need to keep in mind that for those, only biogenic emissions are eligible according to the delegated act that we have explained. When looking at this in a bit more detail, we can see that from a total of more than 800 million tons of CO₂ in 2022, which were eligible as CO₂ point sources, towards 2050, this is restricted to just biogenic emission sources. So that's roughly restricted to about 370 million tons. On top of that, there are still process emissions and energy-related emissions of roughly 130 million tons process emissions and a similar amount fossil fuel emissions or energy emissions, but these wouldn't be eligible anymore for e-fuel production. What we saw is that in 2022, the largest emitters were mostly the big industries, chemicals, cement, but also waste, paper, and then refineries. The biogenic emissions were fairly scattered all around Europe. If we looked at the map in 2050, we learned that still very large emission volumes come from the traditional industry, chemicals, iron and steel, and cement production, as we still expect them to produce a significant amount of materials. Next to that, we saw a stronger increase of bioproducts as biomethane, bioethanol, biodiesel production, and a stronger footprint of these on the European map. When we take one step back from these results, what else did we learn in the course of this study? Apart from obviously, a difficult strive to find the relevant data, so data transparency is an important element, we thought it's now very important as a next step to actually construct feasible ramp-up scenarios, given the constraints that we have explained. And on top of that, there will be new constraints which will have to be considered, for example, around the CO₂ purity from specific emission locations, but also economic constraints and transport constraints where it doesn't, for example, considering where it would make sense to establish a transport network or where it would make less economic sense. We think that it needs a monitoring of the feasible biogenic CO₂ availability if the EC does want to follow its modeling pathway roughly to ensure that actually the CO₂ is available for e-fuel production in the long run and can facilitate also the investments in these facilities with a sufficiently long time horizon. And beyond that, it now really needs an adequate and timely regulation and market design where these elements still fit. Some countries are already a bit farther, other countries are a bit behind, and there's probably a lot to learn from different jurisdictions. Let's say, for example, from some elements from the Nordics or some elements from the UK, where they're a bit further progressed. And that now needs to be analyzed and considered for the European and domestic cases where some of the lawmaking will have to take place. And then we'll hopefully see the industry emerging soon. That's it as an input from myself. Many thanks for listening. I'm looking forward to the discussion. And with that, I will hand back. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lino. I think these are quite impressive results. Our Excel sheet has now 3,700 data points for 2022. And of course, members of the eFuel Alliance, but also the Electric Natural Gas Coalition have access here. So it's also interesting for project developers to identify clusters and key regions where also in future the production of e-fuels makes sense. And of course, CO₂ sources is just one side of the coin. You also need cheap and abundant electricity in addition. With that, I also like to introduce a third person, Rafik Amar from the Electric Natural Gas Coalition. Rafik, I thank you a lot for supporting our study, and maybe you want to introduce the Electric Natural Gas Coalition just with a few words.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yes, so it was a pleasure to work on this study indeed. So thank you, Quantia Economics, also for all the work to map and also gather all the numbers regarding the different CO₂ point sources. So the Electrical Natural Gas Coalition is a global alliance representing the entire value chain of electrical natural gas, or e-methane. From the producer, distributor, transporter, and user, and with some ship owners. The CO₂ is a vital element to produce methane, so that's why having those members are really important. I will, I think, wrap up the session, perhaps after some questions and Q&A that some of you could have regarding the study. And yeah, I will just say a few words at the end. So perhaps I saw that we have one question already in the chat, right?
Yeah, that's right. We have a first question by Tuli Denier from CO₂ Value Europe, another brilliant association in the Brussels bubble. Julie is asking, CO₂ emitters have been included, especially taking into account that not all member states have included them in the ETS. So maybe Lino, you can briefly explain the potential and how we have gathered the data here.
Indeed, that's a good question. And we stumbled across these in the analysis and decided to take stock of the full kind of waste incineration emissions, so that we have it readily available and that we have it within the data set and the analysis. When it then comes to breaking it down, that obviously becomes more complex. We have also found data, and where not available, needed to take some assumption on how this can be differentiated into the different types of emissions. So that is also reflected and provided with more detail in the report.
Thanks a lot. Then there is a question, how and why the process-related emissions have increased from 2022 to 2050. Due to climate targets, probably he or she has expected a decrease of emissions.
Indeed, a good question, and I can understand that one stumbles across this element. The main driver here is that, first of all, process emissions, we cannot really avoid them or mitigate them as long as we still want to use these production processes to produce the following products. That is, for example, cement, that is iron and steel, and also some products in the refinery sector. And for these sectors, there's also an expectation that we're at least going to have a similar level of production in the long run, if not an increasing production level in the long run even. So that from process emissions are expected to stay constant or even increase.
Yeah, and I think it's important to add that I think we have to keep these industries in Europe in times we are discussing resilience and dependency on other countries. I think we cannot afford to import all the steel or cement or basic chemicals. For that reason, these process-related emissions will stay, and we have to think about their best use. Let me maybe insert a question from myself. You have shown that there will be a huge potential of biogenic sources. I think more than 300 million ton. Can you maybe elaborate if all of this will be economic and technical feasible to use, or and would it be enough to cover the potential demand of e-fuels in future? And why probably we need industry emissions in addition?
Indeed, we have found that there are potentially, following the EU modeling expectations, more than 300 million tons of biogenic emissions in the long run across Europe. But there's probably one important point here is what I just said is across Europe. So these are going to be produced, the biofuels, but also used, that is mostly combusted for different purposes. We could have large scale combustion, for example, in some of the industrial applications that we have mentioned, where these bioproducts then substitute fossil products that have been used so far or are being used so far. And that then leads to a shift from energy related fossil emissions to biogenic emissions in potentially large scale point sources. At the same time, we see in particular in the status quo that the biogenic emission sites, they're fairly spread, and the individual sites have much lower emission volumes than the large industrial sites. And in that sense, practical potential, that the biogenic emission potential might be a bit lower. We suggested that as a next step for further analysis that includes, for example, then also considering transport constraints. Where does it make sense to set up a CO₂ economy, to CO₂ transport networks, etc. There are constraints to specific industrial combustions, for example, due to the CO₂ purity. And more generally, this then boils down to an economic question. Where do we have sufficient volumes from biogenic sources in a sufficient quality that we can use? So the actual potential is likely to be much lower than the theoretical full potential, which we identified of more than 300 million tons. And that needs then to be analyzed carefully how much of this can actually be used for e-fuel production, and could mean that it might make sense to also concentrated emission point sources with large volumes for economically high value, low cost production sites.
Thanks a lot. I think the next question, Rafik, is more on our business, a bit more political, or a broader debate. Reinhard Otten is asking why we have focused only on Europe. Doesn't it make more sense to produce e-fuels outside of Europe, because there are better conditions for wind and sun? Maybe you can elaborate a bit what's the problem here, and why we see large investments also in Europe at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, for the production, it is first also in terms of regulation aspects. The regulation is different in other regions. There's EU is the only one with a framework for the utilization of the industrial CO₂, which creates also a lack of level playing field when you have to select the region where you have to implement your manufacture and your production. There is also then a question of certification aspect and methodology that you will use to get the sustainability criteria out of your e-fuels that you will produce from this CO₂. So we focus on Europe, on Central Europe, but just Europe also in general. European Union in general, to make sure that we could clearly reflect where, in terms of geographies, the CO₂ is located, but also understand the disparity regarding the 368 million tons of biogenic CO₂. The number is huge, but the number doesn't cover the production of the e-fuels plus the objective of the storage of the CO₂, if we put in addition the two of them. So there is also a lack of CO₂ infrastructure and the availability of biogenic CO₂ in enough quantity to produce. So yeah, having this map helped us to better frame where we could meet the targets regarding all the target that the EU set with the RFNBO's one, for example, but also any of the targets that member states implemented, if they are more ambitious than what just the EU said.
Thanks a lot, Rafik. And I think in addition, it's important to say that the industrial point sources outside of Europe needs to be in an effective carbon pricing system, as I've said in the beginning. For that reason, it's impossible to use industrial point sources outside of Europe at the moment. So in our analysis of point sources, we have more focused on Europe. Also to show to different member state representatives and members of the parliament the potential in their individual regions. Lino, you already typing the answer to the next question. So maybe I just read it out and you can answer to all of us. Friedrich Dinkelacker is asking, why is the production of biofuels linked with a CO₂ point source? I thought the C from the biosphere is transferred into this CXHY biofuel, but not released as CO₂.
Thank you. I can see there are a lot of questions on the methodology, and happy to take as many as possible. But I also want to say that we're publishing the report today, and there will be more detail on the methodology. So you can look up all of these things there as well. But to this question, maybe now that we've picked it up, is that in the production of these biofuels, for example, when CO₂ and CH4, i.e. methane, when these are separated, then there are also CO₂ emissions that occur. And we have captured these emissions as well. We can provide more details on that, but then I think that goes much into the details, but happy to provide more info if needed.
The next question is also, I think, to you. It's about the threshold and the size of point sources which have been taken into account. Maybe you can say what kind of threshold.
So I think there's a number of facets to this. First of all, we wanted to capture kind of as much as possible in terms of emission sites across Europe. And because we had also this idea of, for example, identifying clusters of emissions, which can be interesting for the case or for the question that we're looking at hand. Then we had some restrictions based on the data sets that we could find. And one of restriction is, for example, that for industrial emission activities, there's a limit to be part of the European emission reporting database of around 100,000 tons of CO₂ per year. When we looked at other sectors, we went into a much more granular approach, went further down. For example, in biomass plants, we went down to 2,000 cubic meters per hour, or for example, that's roughly had a minimum of roughly saying 10,000 tons of CO₂ per year. So we try to go down to very small, very granular volumes to identify these clusters, but at the same time knowing that these are not necessarily the point sources where it's economically viable then to set up carbon capture activities or potentially even further carbon use activities.
Thanks a lot. Just as an example, for example, for biomethane production, we set the threshold of, I think, production capacity of 2,000 norm cubic meters per hour, which is then aggregated to yearly production capacity. Just to exclude all single small facilities where it's economically probably not feasible to produce or to combine the production of e-fuels. But we have considered clusters. So because we have the to each other, we have taken it into account as a larger plant. And the same we have done for biodiesel and bioethanol production. And of course, there are uncertainties, like we always have with assumptions. Nobody knows what kind of refinery will still exist in 2050, as we can assume to have a decrease of the number of refineries. And probably also number of steel or cement factories. So the data has to be taken with a bit of caution, but as said, we want to start a discussion here to not forget about these unavoidable process-related emissions. The next question by Oleksiy Tatarenko is important, I think. It was not the task of the study to compare the CO₂ point sources with the potential demand, although Lino has done it in one of the last slides. There are many studies around forecasting a future demand of e-fuels. Some are only focusing on hard-to-abate sector, then the demand is quite low and probably can be covered by biogenic sources. Others are including other sectors, industry, heat market, for example, in addition, and then the demand for e-fuels can be much higher. In our study, we just want to show what CO₂ sources are available and where and how the development looks like until 2050. And then we would like to leave it to a market and then to decisions by business developers where to produce these e-fuels. And we think it makes sense, as already said, to include the always or often high concentrated and therefore economic feasible to use. And as Lino has said, not everywhere a technology switch or a fuel switch is possible. So I guess also in future we will need some kind of cement. We will not start building with wood again or something like this. But of course, if there is a technology in future which can avoid these process-related emissions, then the definition has to change, and then it is not unavoidable anymore. Coming to the next question. It's about emission threshold again. I think we have sufficiently answered it. Carsten Enström is asking if there is sufficient eligible CO₂ sources available or accessible in relation to the e-fuel quotas, for example, Refuel EU Aviation. Rafik, what do you think? What would you answer here?
European Commission impact assessments. I would say yes. There would be sufficient CO₂ sources available to meet all the e-fuels quota. But when we deep dive into the details, and that's what the quantitative economy study shows, is that there's a lot of disparity regarding where these sources are located. So many biogenic CO₂ sources are located with a really small amount that doesn't allow to produce a significant volume of e-fuels. We also discovered that some hub and cluster are appearing in Scandinavian countries, but we need to transport this CO₂. We need also to make sure that the CO₂ is pure enough to produce. So yes, there is sufficient CO₂ sources. If we include also the processing CO₂, we have more than enough CO₂. But the question again is to make sure in which quantity is it available and where the manufacturer will be implemented.
Thanks a lot. If I may add, my personal opinion is that we would have a higher share of final investment decisions if we have more eligible CO₂ point sources available, and also the production cost could be decreased here. Luis Martinez Belandri is asking about direct air capturing sources. This, of course, is a technology which could be available in future. It's not on a technology readiness level where it can be used in an industrialized level right now. But we will need direct air capturing for sure in regions where we have no point sources available. And these regions often have a lot of wind and a lot of sun. And anyway, we'll need direct air capturing for negative emissions. So it's a technology which has to come and which will come, and probably also take market shares from CO₂ point sources. But we have to start right now with what is available right now. And these are industrial CO₂ point sources. For that reason, yes, we have to develop direct air capturing, but we cannot wait until direct air capturing is available and economic affordable. That's what I would answer here. Next question is from Daniel Freil from Hydrogen Europe. It's an important point which we need to discuss. If I understand him right, it's about lock-in effects. So if we say these industry emissions are unavoidable, then maybe there won't be any development in alternative technologies. I don't know, Lino and Rafik, what is your opinion here?
Yeah, first according to the study, we saw that the amount is significant, 130 million tons of CO₂, but it's not sufficient alone. Here, the position that we have is more on the fact that this will still remain unavoidable CO₂. It will enter the atmosphere in any cases. So if we couple it with CCS, it would serve to produce more. But there is no word where we are opposing the biogenic and the industrial one. So we want just to consider all the different options on the table. So yeah, so I don't think it will be less incentives for the industry who decarbonize overall. But of course, I mean, it's subject to discussion. Huh?
Lino, would you like to add something here?
Well, it also depends on what is kind of driving the incentive to decarbonize, and are there still remaining kind of cost or price incentives? And that will then also be reflected in the development of the respective industry and the relative cost differences, unless there are government interventions in favor of the one or the other technology. So far, what we looked at is really we differentiated kind of energy-related emissions, some of which the EC modeling still expects to exist in 2050. These can be more easily, I would say, abated than the process related emissions. And underlying the assumptions in the EC modeling as long as we don't have alternative processes that can be used in these industries that we have mentioned, then these process emissions are expected to remain and hard to decarbonize. And on what time frame this will be the case is then uncertain. This really then comes down to technological development and innovation. No.
Thanks a lot. I think the definition of unavoidable process-related industry emissions has to be frequently reviewed. And if there are technologies, if there are new ways which can avoid these CO₂ emissions, then the definition can be adapted and changed. I think this is a process which can be solved. There's a quite specific question, Lino, about the cement sector. And which type of decarbonization solution has been assumed. So CO₂ produced emissions by the calcination is assumed as biogenic, ? In the CO₂ emissions in 2050 bar chart, cement sector emissions are included in the non-metallic minerals bar ? Can you say a bit how you have taken into account the cement sector and differentiated between energy, which can be switched to biogenic, and the process emissions?
So maybe on the third question, yes, the cement sector in the bar chart is part of the non-metallic mineral parts. And the question, there it is, it just hopped away. And what we build on in terms of kind of the full system modeling, as I mentioned, the EC 2040 impact assessment modeling, which also assumes underlying it some trends in, for example, the building sector materials that are used. When it comes to the production level of the cement sector itself, we have used kind of the current state of art technology and expected technology, and there the currently known split between energy-related and process-related emissions.
As you are typing in, we try our best, but in any case, you can always reach out to us. Our mail addresses are on the webpage, and Linus is on the presentation, which we will share with all of you afterwards. There's maybe one additional question more to us, Rafik. It's about should we anticipate that the eFuel production will be small scale and fragmented, localized on selected plants? What about the logistics? Will we have to store the fuel in segregated tanks? ? What do you think?
I think that we need also these amounts, these small amounts of biogenic CO₂ and processing CO₂, also to create some circular economy. Many manufacturers could produce some CO₂ or treat some CO₂ for the food industry, for other industries that could take directly a small or invest also in infrastructure to transport the CO₂. I still think that regarding the different targets that the EU set up and the implementation of, for example, the Renewable Energy Directive, but also on the demand side for the aviation, the maritime, the road, they will need to switch to alternative fuels and synthetic fuels. So we will need some large scale manufacture. And this map helped us to map them and to see where is the best location or close to which manufacturer I could implement the project to get sufficient CO₂ to produce fuel. I think Yeah, that maybe, do you want Tobias to add something, or do we want to wrap up? I see that there's still a lots of questions here. As
Yeah.
Tobias mentioned, we could have a follow-up, perhaps email with some answers. This is more work to do altogether, or we could also follow up with other conversation and discussion. So if I may perhaps, do you want to say something or add something? No, Tobias?
Just wanted
Yeah.
to add, having a look in our Excel sheet,
Mhm.
that it doesn't has to be small and fragmented. So just having a look on the largest emitters of process-related emissions. It's, for example, the first Alpine steel factory in Austria with 4.6 million ton of process-related emissions. In Salzgitter in Germany, it's still 4 million ton of process-related emissions. And then there are also quite interesting big biogenic sources, like the Crystal Union biodiesel and ethanol factory in France with 3 million ton, or the waste incineration in Angers with 2.6 million ton, also in France, or the pulp and paper factory by Metsä Fibre in Finland with 2.2 million ton of biogenic potential. So there are large point sources for quite large production of e-fuels. Before coming to your wrap up, Rafik, I would like to take a last question, because I think it's important to answer this by Lucas Leppard. He is worried about the climate impact, because if we use these industrial CO₂ point sources, which have been stored in the material, in the limestone, in other things, then of course, if a combustion of the e-fuels takes place, it will add CO₂ to the atmosphere. So in the end, it will increase the concentration of CO₂ in the atmosphere. And for that reason, I mentioned in my introductory statements CCS, but we will need CCS anyway for these emissions. So these emissions are unavoidable. They will probably stay in Europe. And if we need CCS anyway, we can use them one time more before that for e-fuel production as well. This would be my answer. And then we are in combination with the compensation via CCS almost climate neutral in a life cycle perspective. With that, Rafik, you prepared some last words, and please don't forget to thank Lino again
Yeah.
for his work and
Yep.
his.
Yeah. Sure. Thank you. Thank you to all of you for the participation. Thank you to Lino and his team to make this study. So this session also is really important, reflecting the important study and our broader objective. So this analysis confirms that Europe has a significant CO₂ point sources potential, both today and in 2050, which can underpin the scale up of the e-fuels and renewable energies. So we see that while biogenic sources remain essential and fully eligible, they alone will not be sufficient to meet the ambitious production needs identified in Europe 2040 impact assessments and 2050 climate pathway. So especially if we took into account the objective of the carbon storage that we just mentioned, in addition to the synthetic substitution. So the study also highlights the process emission in the hard-to-abate industry. We talked about steel, we talked about cement and chemical. So they will remain significantly present, even as energy emission declines. So these are not marginal. The number shows up to 130 million tons of CO₂ per year of process-related emissions still affected in 2050. So it's the equivalent to more than 36 billion liter of synthetic fuel if harnessed effectively. So of course, the EU regulation today narrows the eligibility, but the analysis allowed us to better understand the gap between regulatory frameworks and the technical realities. So here, as a joint study, our role is to keep ensuring that the data and evidence guide the debate, so that future policy choices are pragmatic, credible, and aligned with the scale of the challenge regarding, for example, the regarding this delegated act on industrial emission. So another key takeaway is the importance of the geographies and sectorial clustering. The mapping identified industrial corridors in Germany, Benelux, northern Italy, and other regions that could offer natural hubs for cost-effective CO₂ collections, transport, and reuse. This is not vital only for one or two fuels, it's for the broader e-fuel sector in general. So in short, this study shows that both the potential and the constraints tell us that Europe must be ambitious, realistic, and data-driven in its approach to distribute resources for the e-fuel, and it reinforces the global mission that we set it here. Thanks again to Frontier Economics, Lino and his team. Thanks to eFuel Alliance joining us realizing this study. So thank you also for your participation, for your questions, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.